For all its beauty and splendor, the wilderness can be a cruel teacher. To hike alone is to court disaster. Solitude has its appeal, but the wilderness has no mercy. One misstep, one wrong turn, one storm, and you are on your own. An injury can cripple you, a lost trail can doom you. There's no hand to pull you up if you fall, no voice to call for help when you're lost, and no one to share the load when trouble finds you. Alone, the gamble is yours and the stakes are life itself. Let's venture back to the savage wilderness, where survival is earned, not given. This is Outdoor Disasters. For Michael Kalantarian, his Mount Clark climb would be an unmitigated disaster. On October 14, 1986, the 30-year-old Kalantarian took 2 days off from his job at the Curry Company in Yosemite Valley to tackle the mountain alone. Rising 11,522 feet or 3,511 meters, Mount Clark cuts a stark figure among the Sierra peaks, its white granite catching the eye like a beacon. The mountain promised solitude, challenge, and a view of Yosemite's wild backcountry. Kalantarian, eager to claim his first summit, couldn't resist the call. Margaret Colvin, a colleague, dropped him at the Mono Meadows Trail, and he set off with quiet resolve. He camped overnight, pressing onward the next morning toward the summit. By midday, he had climbed far but was falling behind schedule. Mount Clark's steep, knife-edged arêtes loomed above him, demanding respect and care. He had no rope, no partner, and little margin for error. Still, he pushed forward, unwilling to turn back. Mount Clark stands tall at the northern edge of the Clark Range, its granite face visible from nearly every peak in Yosemite. It is a mountaineer's mountain, one of 33 peaks in the Sierra Nevada known for its beauty and challenge. The Northwest Arête, a thrilling Class 4 climb, tests even seasoned climbers with its steep, exposed ridges. Here, every move matters. The terrain is unforgiving, the weather unpredictable, and the risks ever-present. For Kalantarian, the mountain's challenge was irresistible. But Mount Clark, like all wilderness, does not forgive recklessness. Michael Kalantarian took a gamble. Climbing alone with no partner to steady his hand or carry his burden, he told no one his route or his plan. He hadn't registered his hike with the Park Service. The backcountry office wouldn't know if he came back late or not at all. Even his co-workers at the Curry Company were in the dark. None of this stopped him. The mountain loomed, and Kalantarian pressed on, racing the October sun as it dipped toward the horizon. To save time, he left his gear behind at a bivouac site, a mile and a half back, along with his survival supplies. He climbed light, relying on hands and feet to scramble up the granite. The mountain's demands were unrelenting, and then he saw it. A steep slab of ice left by an early storm. It glittered in the fading light, a cold barrier. He stopped, the frustration sharp in his chest. To find another route now, with the day slipping away, was no small task. But Kalantarian had no choice. He knew the ice was beyond him. No rope, no crampons, no technical skills for this kind of climb. He'd faced something like this before. An earlier attempt on Mount Clark had ended when illness turned him back. But this time, he wouldn't quit. He scouted another path, steep but free of ice. It looked doable, manageable even. He convinced himself he could make it without a rope, but he couldn't. Kalantarian, determined to summit despite the growing risks, began climbing his newly discovered route, a steep 5.7 rated ascent that he hoped would lead him to the top. The terrain was unforgiving, the granite slick from the recent storm, but Kalantarian pressed on, his hands gripping the cold rock, his feet searching for stable holds. Each move required precision, but he was exhausted, the weight of his decisions beginning to take a toll on both his body and mind. As he reached for what appeared to be a solid handhold, his foot slipped. In an instant, the world tilted, and he lost his grip. Gravity seized him, and Kalantarian plummeted down the rock face, helpless to stop his fall. The wind rushed past him, his body twisting uncontrollably as he tumbled down the mountain. After a terrifying drop of 70 feet, he crashed into the branches of a low, brushy pine tree. The impact was violent, the branches snapping as they broke his fall. He lost consciousness almost immediately, his body limp in the tree's boughs. An hour passed before he awoke, groggy and disoriented, draped awkwardly across the tree. Pain surged through him as he tried to move. He could barely focus. His vision blurred from a head injury sustained in the fall. Slowly, he realized the extent of his injuries. His right ankle was shattered, his wrist was broken, and numerous other injuries covered his body, leaving him bruised and bleeding. Struggling to remain conscious, Kalantarian tried to pull himself together. The pain was excruciating, every movement sending shockwaves through his body. He attempted to stand, knowing that he needed to get his bearings and assess his situation, but his broken ankle couldn't support his weight. With sheer determination, he forced himself upright, leaning heavily on the tree for support. The pain was almost unbearable, but he knew he had no choice. He looked around, trying to orient himself. The sky was beginning to darken, the last light of day slipping away. He was alone, injured, and far from help. He knew that he needed to move, to find some way to signal for rescue or at least find shelter for the night, but his injuries made even the smallest step feel impossible. Desperation began to creep in as the reality of his situation sank in. The cold was already seeping into his bones, and without his gear he had no way to stay warm through the freezing night ahead. He tried to think of a plan, but his mind was clouded by pain and the creeping fear of his isolation. Kalantarian knew he was in a dire situation. He had to make a decision, either try to crawl his way to safety or conserve his strength and hope that someone would come looking for him. But as the darkness closed in, he realized that he might not survive the night if he didn't find some way to get help. His hat was gone, his sunglasses too, and so was his water bottle. Despite his best efforts, his limited mobility made searching futile, and he never managed to find any of these items. With the late hour pressing down on him, he couldn't afford to waste any more time. He needed to reach his gear before the night's cold overtook him, and he had to get to a lower elevation. So he began crawling downslope. The terrain was brutal. Every inch he covered cost him dearly in pain, excruciating pain. Worse still, it was mid-October at 11,000 feet, and as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature plummeted. The mercury would soon fall to around 15 degrees. Despite his polypropylene underwear, bunting jacket, and cotton shirt, the cold began to numb the pain from his shattered ankle and broken wrist. But soon, the cold started to numb the rest of him as well. Desperate to relieve some pressure from his swollen ankle, he pried off his boot and discarded it. Now, without a hat or a boot, the risk of frostbite and hypothermia increased dramatically. All he had to fight the cold during this long, freezing night in the high Sierra were the clothes on his back. Thinking quickly, he wrapped his shirt around his head, knowing that about 25% of body heat is lost through the head and neck. The night was just as miserable as he had feared. As dawn broke, Kalantarian resumed crawling, heading in what he hoped was the direction of his camp. He had a map but no compass, making navigation even more challenging. To make matters worse, his injuries prevented him from descending the same steep Class 4 terrain he had climbed earlier, so he detoured westward along somewhat easier ground. However, this route led him away from his pack and the supplies he desperately needed, which were to the northwest. Despite this, his backpack remained his primary goal, even as he crawled in the wrong direction. Even on this easier route to the west, his progress was agonizingly slow and painful. He knew that if he could soon redirect himself toward the northwest, he would face only a 1.5-mile crawl back to his camp. He had to find a way to make it happen. His survival depended on it. No one knew where he was, and no help was coming. During the day, Kalantarian tried to stick to ridgelines, which offered better visibility and more direct sunlight. The warmth of the sun was a small comfort, something he had never appreciated so much before. The ridgelines also allowed him to use the sun as a makeshift compass, helping him to orient himself and choose his route. He continued this grueling crawl, alternating between short bursts of movement and necessary rest, all day long. As dusk approached, he searched for water, hoping to find some from melting ice. Reflecting on his agonizing day didn't bring much solace, but he took some small comfort in the thought that he was closer to his camp, closer to the supplies he needed to stave off hypothermia. and closer to the tools he could use to start a fire. A fire would not only provide warmth, but could also serve as a distress signal. Even if no one saw it, it might be enough to keep him alive through the night. Kalantarian's second night crawling through the wilderness was a harrowing ordeal, filled with relentless cold. The following day was no better, and the same misery repeated itself night after night, day after day. His nights were unimaginably miserable. His feet and fingers seemed to freeze solid each time the sun set. It felt like he was trapped in an endless, nightmarish hell of cold, reserved for condemned solo hikers. Yet, despite the agony, Kalantarian continued to crawl downhill, his body weakened by hunger and the freezing temperatures. Though he never reached his camp, he clung to the belief that he knew where he was headed. Shivering uncontrollably, he stared up at the stars each night, using their movement to orient himself and reassure himself that he had been crawling in the right direction all day. What Kalantarian didn't realize, despite using his map, ridgelines, the sun, and the stars for guidance, was that he was not heading back toward his camp, nor was he on the correct course to return to the original route he had taken to reach his current position. His disorientation was further compounded by the fact that he could see lights in the distance at night, coming from the Clark Range viewpoint on Glacier Point Road. These lights were part of a large-scale search effort, spanning a 50-mile radius, meant to help him orient himself. Tragically, Kalantarian mistook these lights for ordinary vehicle headlights on Glacier Point Road. In reality, he was hopelessly lost and had been for days without even realizing it. Meanwhile, back in Yosemite Valley, when Michael missed 2 consecutive days of work, his boss notified the park authorities about his absence. Initially, there was no clear idea of where to start the search. However, by conducting phone interviews with several backcountry hikers from the past few days, and speaking with his friend Margaret Colvin, the search and rescue coordinator was able to narrow down the search area to the western drainages of Mount Clark. The search and rescue operation, led by John Dill, mobilized 150 searchers, 6 helicopters, and 6 dog teams. These volunteers came from at least 18 different agencies, with only one being the Park Service itself. Margaret Colvin guided rescuers to the exact spot where she had dropped Kalantarian off days earlier. His boot tracks were still visible in the soil. In response, Dill dispatched climbers to the summit of Mount Clark as well as nearby peaks, hoping that Kalantarian might have been either extremely ambitious or severely lost. Unfortunately, none of these efforts yielded any results. The search team utilized nearly every tactic in the SAR playbook. One nagging question persisted. Had Colvin remembered everything Kalantarian had told her about his plans? As a last resort, John Dill asked if she would undergo hypnosis by a trained specialist, hoping she might recall some critical detail about Kalantarian's route. Colvin agreed to the session, and while it successfully brought back more memories about his pack and gear, it failed to reveal any new information about his specific plans. Helicopters crisscrossed the area, transporting searchers from one location to another. One of them broke down, while another flew low and slow directly over Kalantarian's position. Desperate, he painfully waved his shirt at the passing helicopter, convinced that they must have seen him, but they hadn't. Coordinator John Dill worked tirelessly to keep the search effort at full intensity, but no one found any sign of Michael. It was as if he had vanished without a trace. Finally, on October 20th, 7 days after Margaret Colvin had dropped off Kalantarian, searchers discovered boot prints matching his along the ascent route up Mount Clark. Following the trail, they soon came across a cap with a Yosemite logo at the base of the steepest section. A recent photograph of Kalantarian, taken as evidence, showed him wearing that same hat. The team sent the hat and hair samples from Kalantarian's tent in the valley to a forensics lab in Fresno for confirmation. Although this process wouldn't provide immediate answers, it was essential to verify that the items belonged to him. By noon the next day, a searcher spotted a discarded leather boot on a lower forested slope. The boot's sole pattern and size matched the tracks left by the missing man. The searchers were puzzled. How had he lost his boot? About 15 minutes later, a nearby dog team found Kalantarian's pack a mile and a half north of the boot. The backpack was positioned on the northwest ridge leading to the summit, a logical place to leave gear during a summit attempt. However, the location of the boot suggested that Kalantarian had been somewhat off course if he was trying to return to his pack. An hour after discovering the boot, one of the searchers noticed faint drag marks cutting through the underbrush and leading down through the woods. By this time, nearly a week had passed since Kalantarian had plummeted 70 feet into that tree, and the urgency of the situation weighed heavily on the search teams. They knew that every minute counted. The searchers, well trained and relentless in their pursuit, were able to carefully track these drag marks, recognizing their significance. The team that found them immediately radioed their location and the direction they were heading to the searchers positioned downhill. This crucial communication set off a coordinated effort, with teams leapfrogging ahead, scanning for any fresher signs that might lead them to Kalantarian. The dense forest and rugged terrain made the search challenging. The drag marks were faint, nearly invisible in some places, and the searchers had to rely on their experience and instincts to stay on the trail. They knew that Kalantarian, injured and disoriented, would have moved slowly, but the possibility of finding him alive kept their determination high. The strategy proved effective. Within just 26 minutes of spotting the initial drag marks, searchers further down the slope made the long-awaited discovery. Kalantarian was found in a drainage about a mile and a half west of Mount Clark. Incredibly, after crawling through the wilderness for 5.5 days, Kalantarian was still alive. His survival was nothing short of miraculous. Despite his injuries and the harsh conditions, he had managed to cover enough ground to have reached his pack, if only he had been on the correct course. When the searchers informed him of his actual location relative to his gear, he was stunned. He had been so far off course that he couldn't believe how close he had come, yet how tragically far he had been from his supplies. The successful search showed the skill and perseverance of the search and rescue teams, especially considering the uncertainty surrounding Kalantarian's disappearance and the delay before the alarm was raised. However, the outcome was bittersweet. Despite the incredible effort to find him alive, the prolonged exposure to freezing temperatures had taken a severe toll on Kalantarian's body. The hypothermia, combined with the repeated freezing and thawing of his extremities, had led to gangrene. Tragically, both of his feet had to be amputated, and he also lost several fingers to frostbite. Kalantarian's survival was a story of both triumph and tragedy. He had defied the odds by staying alive in the face of overwhelming adversity, but the cost of his ordeal was a lifelong reminder of the dangers he had faced alone in the wilderness. The idea of conquering nature alone might seem romantic, but the harsh reality is that nature doesn't care about your bravery. It will not hesitate to claim your life if you underestimate its power or overestimate your own abilities. When you choose to hike alone, you must be prepared for the reality that no one can help you if things go wrong. Your solitude is your strength, but it's also your vulnerability. Before you set out, tell someone exactly where you're going, your expected route, and when you plan to return. This could be the difference between being found quickly and being lost for days. Carry a satellite phone or personal locator beacon. In areas without cell service, these devices can send a distress signal if you find yourself in trouble. Your life is worth the investment. Know the terrain and weather. Study your route and be aware of potential hazards. Check the weather forecast and prepare for sudden changes. Being informed can prevent many emergencies. Pack essential survival gear. Even if you're traveling light, always carry the basics. First aid kit, extra food and water, a map and compass, fire-starting tools, and appropriate clothing. These items could save your life. Trust your instincts, but respect the risk. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Turn back if conditions become unsafe, even if it means abandoning your goal. No summit or trail is worth your life. Solo hiking is an incredible journey of self-discovery and resilience, but it's not a venture to be taken lightly. Inspiration comes from knowing your limits and respecting the power of nature. Remember, bravery in the wilderness isn't just about pushing forward, it's also about knowing when to step back from an outdoor disaster. If you've made it this far, please consider clicking those subscribe and like buttons. Want more outdoor disasters content? Check out these videos I believe you'll enjoy. Thank you for watching.